everyone. We can do this presentation on what makes that black, the African American aesthetic. So I'm going to start off right away, jump right into it. Most people can identify the various forms of hip-hop culture, and like the music, the dance, the rap, the clothing, or perhaps blues with the blues guitar with a bottleneck slide. However, most people are not familiar with what makes something black. They might recognize something as rhythm and blues, but they're not quite sure what makes Ernie Barnes' painting black. My name is Luana, and I'm a scholar in African American Studies and a professor of dance. And what I want to talk about today is the concept of aesthetics, and specifically African American aesthetics, and what makes something black. In this series, we will look at art that you see and you hear every single day. Specifically, art heavily influenced by the artistry and the aesthetic intelligence of the African American diaspora and tradition. By the end of the series, you'll see art in an expanded way, and hopefully you'll develop more tools for discerning whether art is influenced by the African American tradition or by the Latin traditions, the Mexican traditions, or the East Indian traditions or First Tribe traditions. Brenda Dixon Gottschalk and Robert Ferris Thompson are two eminent scholars in this field, but they're not the only ones that are in this field writing in this subject matter. There are a significant number of scholars writing and lecturing and performing within the African American performance arts, within the painting, the visual arts. So the concept of blackness is very, very dynamic and political, and it is emotional. And not all of these scholars agree whether what is blackness and how we use our blackness today. But one thing they all agree upon is that there is something definitive and deeper generating from the black tradition, from the black diaspora. So in the first part of this lecture, there are 5 parts of this lecture. In the first part of this lecture, I'm going to address the need for scholarship in black aesthetics. Most artists, most art historians, art critics, they're very familiar with a couple of different aspects of the history of Western art. One of them being the Italian Renaissance, with a focus changing from God to humanity, or the specific way that the French Impressionism altered reality or altered our perceptions of reality. And they may even be aware of the dances of Russia coming out of the Harlem, not the Harlem Renaissance, but this is the Dance Theater of Harlem performing Marius Petipa's version of Swan Lake. So they may be familiar with Marius Petipa, who is French but went to Russia, but created this sense of a Russian aesthetic, which contributed to classical dance of the 19th century. So we may not be familiar with what makes something black. That's kind of how that slide kind of went through very fast. We may not be familiar with what makes Jacob Lawrence's Migration series black. We may even look at a black dance, like this is Alvin Ailey's Blues Suite, and go, oh, that's black dance. I can see that, but I don't know how and why that is black dance. I know Alvin Ailey's an African American choreographer, and I know those are black dancers on there who are performing, but are those the individuals that truly define something as being black? Let's take a look at blackness when we think we're hearing it, but there isn't a black person involved. For example,
if you're feeling what you see now, and you like to talk to me now.
So we're listening to, some of us know Tina Marie's music. How many of you have heard this music before? You've heard this particular song. She was known for distinctive soulful vocals. And I'm going to translate that into distinctive black. It was distinctly black vocals. But what does it mean to say that Tina Marie, who was known as the Ivory Queen of Soul when she, after her death, what does it mean to say that her music sounded or looked black? So first thing we're going to do is we're going to define blackness. And blackness is a very, very difficult thing to define. It is influenced by negrophilia, negrophobia, black, African American masking, black self-determination, Black as a performance, Black people. But we're going to go by Dr. Yuba Blay's definition of Blackness for this class and therefore for this video. I think Blackness is beautifully complicated. I think it is a color. I think it is a culture. I think it is a consciousness. I think it is a history. It's a legacy. It's an inheritance. It's a political identity. It's a social identity. It's so many things. But each one of us enters a conversation with a different framework, identifying with whatever one of those parts of Blackness is the most important to us. We speak through our Blackness in those particular ways. So if we look at this again, it's complicated. It's a color, it's a culture, it's a consciousness, a history, a legacy, an inheritance, a political identity, and a social identity. Why go through all this trouble to define Blackness? I think Rebecca Walker, who is Alice Walker's daughter, has a wonderful reason why. We don't separate yoga from India or Hinduism. We don't separate French cooking from the French. And so the result of that is that all of these cultures have a kind of social currency on the global stage. But if Blackness is separated from the culture of origin, I kind of want you to finish that sentence in your head. If Blackness is separated from the culture of origin, then what happens? Here we have a picture of the ambiguous woman. If I'm taught to see the old woman, and only the old woman, with 100% accuracy, I still have 100% deficiency because I wasn't taught to see the young woman also. And I think the same is true of cultural aesthetics. If I'm taught to see and recognize and understand Toulouse-Lautrec, but I'm not able to understand or haven't been taught how to understand Ernie Barnes, then I still have 100% deficiency for myself. So it's really about understanding what makes something Black so that we can have cultural currency as we travel, not just in our own world, but in the United States, but in the whole global field of the arts. So what makes something Black? First I'm going to have to define aesthetic. I'm also going to define slippage, and I'm going to talk about the elements of the aesthetic. And those elements are, as they come together, creates a sense of feeling, a hearing, the consciousness of Blackness, Black aesthetics. So many of the elements that I researched in the last 15 years come from Africanist sensibilities. They came to this country through the enslaved labor, through indentured servants who were African or African American or Caribbean American, and also through the explorers, the Black explorers that came to this country in the last 500 years. Once in this country, they really began to become exposed to other cultures, and a fusion begins to happen. As you see in the Caribbean islands, here they're dancing the chica in the Caribbean islands, and of course here in the United States in the 1940s. So there's a fusion that happens, but there is this retention, this Africanist retention of elements or concepts. You have to be careful, and that's what we're going to talk about now. I'm going to give you a little warning as we look at Black art. You have to be careful of slippage. This is a picture painted by Henry Osawa Tanner, and it is called The Banjo Lesson, and he painted it in 1893. And that date is important because when African Americans began to participate in the arts during the late 1800s to early 1900s, they were using the arts for their personal expression, but they were also using the arts as one way to prove their humanity. And so they were going toward the arts that were more European based than African based. So they were going for a literalness. They were going for an ideology. Tanner was interested in light, in the play of light. Here we have the Annunciation by Tanner, again painted in the late 1800s. This is the moment where, of course, the Virgin Mary is being told by the angel that she's about to give birth. And so he's interested in this light and also the emotion of Mary. Now we're going to look at another artist, Jacob Lawrence, who's painting in another Black experience, Black content, as in the Banjo Lesson. But he has a different take on it all. And of course, this is painted much, much later. What Jacob Lawrence is painting is he's using in this painting a tremendous amount of Africanist elements, and I'm going to talk about those right now. There's a non-hierarchical use of color. And unfortunately, this slide does not show you the red vibrancy that's happening in the minister's robes as he's preaching, and God created man and woman. There's also use of color to express emotions. There's an equality between the background and the foreground. The painting is symbolic. I mean, people really do not look like this, yes? Pearls do not look like this on the neck. Noses do not look like this. This is symbolic. There's a tremendous amount of angularity. There's a vitality. There's also high density. There's a lot happening in this picture. He paints with a style also influenced by Fauvism, which is a French movement. But Fauvism had its own particular brush with Africanist sensibilities. So it's what we call intertextuality, where he's painting with a system that was experimented with in France. However, it had Africanist influences too. So before we go on with more Africanist tenets and what it looks like when we look at a piece of art and whether it's black or is there African American influences in it, I'm going to give you a guide or a rubric or a structure to kind of look at art, all art, not just the ones I'm showing today. Most individuals look at a piece of art and look at the visible features. Was the artist black? Was the choreographer black? Was the singer, the rapper? Were they African American? Were they Latin? What's the content? What's the picture about? What's the song about? What's the play about? And they'll determine that it may be Africanist or European or Japanese based on those visible features alone. And that's erroneous. This is where you can slip into an assumption, and that's what we call slippage. You slip into an assumption that there is an affinity of this art with a particular culture, but you have to go deeper. Surface structures. A surface structure is like an organization of elements that come together and influence one another. For example, call and response, improvisation, and syncopation can be in a piece of jazz music. And so those are examples of that organization or of surface structures. And usually those reflect a deeper structure. But in this case, we're talking about the African American aesthetic. That deeper structure I call the cultural intelligence or the cultural aesthetic. And you can't really see that aesthetic, you only see evidence of it. And that evidence is going to be sitting inside of the surface structure. So let's go on and talk about this in another way. But you can kind of use this guide or this rubric when you're looking at art and you're trying to determine, like when we saw Blue Suite. Okay, the choreographer was African American and the dancers were African American, but is Blue Suite considered black art? The answer is yes, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But you can't just use the visible features. I'm also going to step back again and define aesthetics. I have 5 definitions up here of aesthetics. I think they all kind of play together. Pleasing to the senses, not just the senses, but your senses, deep inside. You'll look at something and it just sounds right, or it feels right, or it dances correctly, or you can really resonate with it. You have a sense or an experience of beauty where you look at something and you just think, oh my goodness, that is so beautiful, or that is so ugly. One of those two. It's an energy vibration. An aesthetic is an energy vibration. And related to that, it's a family of characteristics. And we're going to talk about that family right today. It's a family of characteristics. It's also a visual, auditory, and physical feast. When I go to Ailey and I'm watching the African American aesthetic on that stage, I'm just languishing in the feast that Alvin Ailey is giving me, or George Fajan, or Ulysses Dove, one of the choreographers. It's an absolute feast. Now, every single culture has its own list. I'm going to talk about the 69 tenets that I have found for the African American aesthetic. But each aesthetic has its own set. I only have 3 cultures here and only 2 examples from each one of those cultures. But let's just take from the first tribe, or Native American aesthetic. A dancer who stands out from the others destroys the beauty of the group moving as one. That's the opposite of Russian ballet. That's the opposite of New York City ballet. Everyone is moving toward the pinnacle, to become the prima ballerina or the major dancers in that company. You want to stick out. You want to show. Of course, not if you're in the chorus, but you want to show as an individual dancer. But in the Native American or First Tribe aesthetic, that would be completely inappropriate. So we're going to look at Matisse. Henri Matisse. He was very interested, of course he's French, he was very interested in the Africanist sensibility of how they used color to display emotions. He was very interested, and this particular piece is called the green stripe or the green line. He was interested in how the face could be used as a mask, and here are two paintings that he painted, and you see the difference between the two. He was interested in the African mask and how things were conceptual versus realistic. He was very interested not just in African masks, but all sorts of ritual art and tribal art. He had this kuba or bakuba cloth from the Dominican Republic of the Congo all over his studio. And we see over here one of his famous paintings, and it was inspired perhaps by that particular type of cloth. Now, I'm going to talk about aesthetic pillaging and appropriation and cultural imperialism a little bit later on. So for right now, I'm going to continue on with the tenants, but that is a little bit at play here, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So let's start with the tenets of the African American aesthetic. Efficacious technique. This is where there's a specific function of the dance. And you're not concerned with the shape or the form, like for example, a pirouette would be here. But if you're dancing love and loss, or love and new love versus old love, that pirouette may be here, or the passe may be here, or it may be here, or maybe here, or maybe here. The movement is shaped by the intention, not by a shape or form or prescribed criteria. Movement is shaped by the intention. Loud. Now, loud is when the signal is louder than it needs to be, and that can be visual, it can be auditory, it can be in color, it can be in your actions, it can be in a lot of different levels. And so this is a little bit on the loud side. Even though the colors in this particular shot are a little bit muted here, they're pretty loud. Festive stylization. This is where the body is a canvas. It can be your hair design, it can be scarring, tattooing, your clothing, but there's festive stylization. And remember earlier when I talked about a lot of these tenets are Africanist retentions? Here we have two great pictures. These are my favorite pictures. The first one is by Hans Silver of the Omo tribe in Ethiopia, and the second one is by Vincent Pamparo of the Karo tribe. And here we have perfect examples of festive stylization, or the body used as a canvas. This one is suspended beats. This is where a rhythm is set up and then it's broken. We see that in voguing, we see that in breakdancing, we hear it in jazz music all the time. So suspended beats. The next one is conjoining of the sacred and the secular. This is going to church on stage. Alvin Ailey does this in Wade in the Water and many parts of the Revelations dance. Ray Charles does it. Aretha Franklin will do it. Speaking of Ray Charles, let's listen to a piece of music, and I want you to listen to the first word, and then which sounds like he's in church, and then he's going to go on and talk about a particular woman, which we know he's no longer in church. And then he's going to go back and say a couple more words, and it feels like he's back in church again.
Well, I got a woman way over town that's good to me. Oh, yeah.
The well and the oh, yeah, we're in church, but I've got a woman and she's way over town and she's good to me. We're not in church, all right? So this is a blending of the sacred and the secular. Then there's isolations and polycentrism. Isolation is moving one body part at a time. Polycentrism is if I'm moving my pelvis and I'm moving my rib cage and then I'm moving my shoulders. I have multiple centers going on at one time. Of course, that's the great Catherine Dunham. Fusion technique. This is admiration of the black-brown body. These are two different ones. Fusion technique happens in jazz all the time, right? Jazz is a fusion technique. And then there's admiration of the black-brown body as it is, it's a beautiful sensibility, and we use it, the colors and the hues, as part of the aesthetic. Now, there are 69 tenets in all that I found, and I know I talked about that before. And they operate together. So I'm just going to let you watch syncopation and timbral variation. All of these come into play. The important thing is that you cannot separate any one of these. They all play together. They all influence one another. Improvisation will influence instrument switching, which is a horn sounding like a human voice and the human voice sounding like a trumpet. Or percussive will affect high density. Syncopation will affect cross rhythms, so actually they naturally go together. So it's really important to, as you see these coming in, to know that they operate together like the sun. Where do you find, if you want to go and look for more aesthetic tenets? You can go to music, you can go to jazz, John Coltrane, Alice Coltrane. You can go to Jimmy Ace, or Jimmy Scott rather, or Johnny Ace, listening to music. You can look back to slavery. What were the arts that came out of slavery? What were the foods, the dances, the music that came out of slavery? Here we have the ring shout. You can go to interesting places. Well, this is not interesting. This is actually very sad in a way. But you can go to erroneous incarceration that happened during the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was a way for states and specifically the South to gain work back, to gain workers back, free labor. But out of the blues, out of this environment came the blues. It's one of the contributing factors to the blues. So you can listen to people like Son House, who we'll hear a little bit later on today. You can go to the Harlem Renaissance and read and watch, look at the sculptures, or look at the visual arts, or the dancing. You can go to theater, like Joe Turner's Come and Gone. It was created by African American cast, usually directed by an African American. Or you can do something like this, go to Timbuktu, or this particular play, which was created by two European Americans. But it was directed and choreographed and costumed by an African American, Joffrey Holder. In fact, this is his art that we're looking at right here, Joffrey Holder, and performed by African Americans, including Eartha Kitt. You can look at and reread some of the great artists, the great literary artists. This is Toni Morrison, but you can go back to Sonia Sanchez and Zora Neale Hurston. You can re-listen to Etta James, Dinah Washington, Nancy Wilson, these great singers, Aretha Franklin, along with Marvin Gaye, as I mentioned before, Jimmy Scott, and Johnny Ace. You can look at the expressive arts, like quilting. These two are quilts. Or to the marching bands, the black marching bands of the historic black colleges. You can find these tenets there. And of course, you can go to dance. That was Ailey. This is Camille Brown, Sauvignon Glover, Michael Jackson. You can look at their work and really see all of these tenets that I'm talking about. Travel, travel, travel. And wherever you travel, I want you to dance the dances. It's one thing to put it in your mind through reading and through watching a culture's genius, but something else to put it in the body. So after doing that, we come back to Jacob Lawrence's migration series, The Shoemaker, and we begin to identify some things that are Africanist in here. We're going to look at a piece called Hell's a Bopping, choreographed in 1941 by Frankie Manning. So let's take a look at this. Ngoma. Ngoma is a combination of music and dance being one. It's one aspect. It's not music and dance, it's music dance. So it's Ngoma. Syncopation, suspended beats, low sense of gravity, and it's percussive. As you watch this dance a little bit later on, you're going to see this percussiveness come in. Improvisation. Limbic resonance, that is when, for myself as a performer, I'm saying something that is so true for you, it rings a bell or it strikes a chord in you. And so me as a performer and you as a secondary performer or the audience members, we both have that same feeling, the same sense of what is going on. That's limbic resonance. It's athletic, competitive. I talked about the angularity, virtuosic speed. Oh my goodness, this piece is so fast. Energy of the moment shapes the form. That's what I was talking